One of the comments that Protestant YouTubers receive all the time is, "What are you protesting?" And I'll be honest, I used to find these comments somewhat annoying. I wasn't protesting anything. I was simply existing as a Christian in the only Christian community I'd ever known. And I think that's true for the majority of Protestants. But it's not true for all Protestants. In fact, the more you study church history, the more you're forced to reckon with the nature of Protestantism. Even if you prefer the idea of Protestantism as a reform rather than a protest, or if you want to argue that the etymology of Protestant is related more to giving witness than protesting, it remains the case that Protestantism inevitably exists in some relationship to the Catholic Church out of which it came. And once you come to that conclusion, it's a fair question to ask, what are you protesting? In fact, I think it's one of the most important questions that Protestants can ask. Because here's the deal. If you don't have good reasons for being Protestant, the general force of history and tradition will likely lead you to becoming Catholic or Orthodox. Let me explain. Many Protestants have lost any sense of a thick Protestant identity grounded in the Reformation. This has been accelerated by the rise of non-denominational churches, which, by nature, cut themselves off from the past, at least institutionally. To a lot of evangelical Protestants, Protestantism is a simple default type of Christianity. The historical narrative that we're given is that soon after the time of the apostles, the church went off the rails, and the gospel was lost in the Middle Ages before it was rediscovered by Luther. Then we pretty much skip over everything from Luther to the present because we assume that all Luther did was read the Bible in its plain meaning, and so we can do the same, no history needed. That is, to put it nicely, a woefully inadequate picture of church history generally, and the Reformation specifically. And if this is the picture you're operating with, when you find out that the Catholic Church didn't just make up a bunch of stuff in the Middle Ages and it didn't stop worshiping Christ, you'll rightly ask yourself, what on earth am I protesting? To put a finer point on it, if you're protesting against the Catholic Church because you believe it's not Christian, that's a pretty hard protest to maintain, especially if you value history. It's also not the protest at the heart of the Reformation. Personally, if my options were between a sort of fundamentalist restorationism that saw everyone since the time of the apostles being wrong and Catholics not being saved, or being Catholic, I'd choose being Catholic every single time. And I suspect the Reformers would have too. As just one example, Luther in his frustration with Zwingli's view of the Eucharist famously said, "I'd rather have blood with the Papists than wine with the Zwinglians." Luckily, you don't have to make this choice. There is, however, a rather easy choice to make, and that's to subscribe to this channel. It's free and it goes a long way. An even better choice, though, is choosing to support this channel on Patreon. Videos like these aren't possible without my patrons, and if you'd like to see more, consider supporting the channel at patreon.com/gospelsimplicity or making a one-time donation at paypal.me/gospelsimplicity. Links for those are in the description. The Protestant Reformation, insofar as it was a protest, was not a protest against Catholicism as a whole. It was a protest against specific late medieval Catholic beliefs, some of which had a long history, and others of which were relatively new developments at the time. What separates Protestants then from Protestants now is that back then, Protestants knew what they were protesting. For that reason, I find it incredibly helpful to read sources from the Reformation. It should go without saying, but it must be said. To understand the Reformation, you need to understand the Reformers and their contemporaries. For a short introduction, the exchange of letters between John Calvin and Cardinal Sadoleto offers a great glimpse into this period and what they felt was at stake. On the Anglican side, you might find something like John Jewel's Apology of the Church of England helpful as well. Historical sources like these have the benefit of showing you what the people felt was at stake in the issues. They were willing to die for this stuff, and if you're going to die for something, you probably hold those beliefs pretty firmly and for reasons you find compelling. At the same time, the heat of the debate isn't always the best time for clear, nuanced thinking. And as such, it can be helpful to balance the polemics of that era with more cool-headed ecumenical engagements of the present. For this, you might look at the Lutheran Catholic dialogues of the past 60 years. They've covered a host of topics, and in these you'll find theologians painstakingly trying to articulate where they agree, where they disagree, and where they simply have a different vocabulary. I find this balance of reading old disagreements and new ecumenical engagements incredibly helpful. The old disagreements help you discover the historic roots of Protestantism, but the newer texts help you determine what it means to be Protestant in this day and age. And here is where we return to the heart of the video. If you're going to be Protestant and you're going to study church history, you're going to need clear reasons for being Protestant. It can't just be, I'm Protestant because everything in Catholicism is bad. That's simply not true. And the disagreements are really much more fine than that. If you don't realize that, you will more than likely struggle to maintain your Protestantism. To illustrate this, let's take two examples, Justification and the papacy. Many Protestants say that Catholicism is wrong because it teaches you that you are saved by works. That's misleading at best. If your whole Protestant identity is wrapped up in Catholics teaching that you are saved by works, you might be shaken to the core when you find that the Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches that justification has been merited for us by the passion of Christ, who offered himself on the cross as a living victim, holy and pleasing to God, and whose blood has become the instrument of atonement for the sins of all men. Wait, Catholics believe that Christ saves us? Who knew? Well, just everyone who takes the time to read, my friends. If this was the extent of your engagement, you'd be failing to recognize that the disagreement between Protestants and Catholics is not whether we save ourselves or Christ saves us, but it really has to do with much finer distinctions on things like the role of merit. For instance, we both agree that good works are necessary in the Christian life, but do they merit anything toward our salvation? Can our good works be such that they go above and beyond what is required of us and then can be applied to other people, including those who have died? When it comes to justification, we both agree that we are justified by faith, but Catholics see justification as both an initial gift and an ongoing process of renewal, while Protestants typically understand it as a once-for-all declaration. Even within this, though, we can ask if initial justification means that we are absolved of both the debt and the guilt of sin, or only the guilt. Questions like these, you'll find, are harder questions to answer, but they're by no means unimportant. They shape the entire Christian life as they are connected to everything from penance and purgatory to the Mass and missions. The second example is the papacy. Too often Protestants are taught that the papacy was a late medieval invention. That's simply false. There were popes long before the Middle Ages. The question has more to do with whether the office is established by divine law or human law. In essence, is the papacy a God thing or just a good thing? Furthermore, as time has gone on, the question has increasingly become about papal infallibility. Namely, is it true, in fact, that the Pope is protected from error when speaking on faith and morals in his official capacity as Pope when he intends to bind the faithful to a given decree? Even that sentence is a mouthful, but that's because it had to take into consideration the proper distinctions. Even with those distinctions, it is a much harder idea to defend, especially at the bar of history, than the idea that early Christians believed the Bishop of Rome had a special role in the church. If you protest the latter kind of minimal definition of the papacy, you won't get very far. Now, in the spirit of making good distinctions, let's zoom out for a second. It's important that I make this distinction so you don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that all Protestants who become Catholic did so because they didn't understand the Reformation. That would be a rather silly claim to make. I can think of plenty of people who understood the Reformation deeply, better than I do, in fact, and still became Catholic. Instead, what this video is trying to say is that if Protestants are interested in being truly Protestant, they should be able to answer the question, what are you protesting, my friend? If you're not able to answer that question, but you intend to engage with church history and Catholic theology on its own terms, you're going to more than likely come to find out that your reasons for being Protestant are inadequate. With that being said, I'll offer how I'd respond to the question, what are you protesting? At the heart of my disagreement with Catholicism is the papacy. Put more specifically, I find the doctrine of papal infallibility as articulated and especially as understood at Vatican I to be either inaccurate or functionally meaningless. Now that's a bold claim, so let me explain what I mean. If we take the doctrine at the surface level to be saying that the Pope is infallible when speaking on faith or morals in his official capacity as Pope and when intending to bind the faithful, and that he has indeed done this not just twice but many times, then I think it's inaccurate insofar as the Pope has declared things under these conditions that, again, if we take them at their surface meaning, I don't think are true. Okay, that was a long sentence though. Let's break it down with an example. One that I've cited before is unum sanctum. If this is an instance of a pope speaking under the charism of infallibility, which every external marker would suggest it is at least at the very end, then I believe that the teaching that everyone must be subject to the Roman pontiff to be saved, which I would say is the meaning at a historical, cultural, and linguistic level, well then I think this is wrong. Not only do I think it's wrong, I don't think it aligns with the current teaching of the church at a surface level. We might call this like the objective or external approach to papal infallibility. That is, papal infallibility is something externally verifiable, and when there is external evidence of a pope intending to bind the faithful on a teaching of faith and morals, we can conclude that the statement should be without error. Furthermore, we can evaluate the meaning of the statement as we would other statements, asking if the plain or historical linguistic meaning of the statement is in fact true. Using this approach, the problems, at least for me, have been insurmountable. Thus the protest. However, that's only one way of approaching papal infallibility. The other is a bit more like subjective or flexible. With this, one might say that the Pope has perhaps never actually declared something infallibly. This might sound preposterous, since it certainly seems the popes have thought they were exercising infallibility, but it's legitimately fascinating to see how thoroughly papal infallibility was reimagined by some theologians after Vatican II. One example is the 6th volume of the Lutheran Catholic Dialogues, and it gives a really good window into this. Of course, it's not infallible, but it shows us how some people are thinking about this. In this dialogue, you find some Roman Catholic theologians proposing a theory of fallibilism that, for all intents and purposes, rendered Vatican I null and void, while others proposed a moderate infallibilism that I would wager still would have scandalized the Council Fathers at Vatican I. In essence, after Vatican II, many Catholic theologians thought the philosophical underpinnings of Vatican I were so unworkable or contentious that we needed to redefine our terms here and also bring back greater elements of collegiality as a check on the monarchical views of the past, which just needed updating. In other words, they tried to keep the term without the original meaning, which Vatican I was very much against, but alas. So some of these proposed changes included things like the need for an ecumenical reception of a decree for it to be truly infallible. But the kicker is that this ecumenical reception would include the Orthodox and Protestants, since they're at least in some sense related to the Church, such that nothing in the second millennia could be considered infallible. That might seem wild, but it's just one example. Furthermore, some said infallibility is only a protection from shipwrecking the Church, not getting a statement wrong. So despite what Vatican I said, papal infallibility doesn't mean irreformable, or so the arguments went. It is at this level that I would say papal infallibility becomes functionally meaningless. Much as I prefer that type of definition, I would also say that views of papal infallibility that allow for the meaning of a papal statement to be divorced from the original context, including the Pope's intention, make papal infallibility so malleable that it doesn't seem to mean much at all. Of course, again, none of these interpretations are themselves magisterial, and I'm not saying that Vatican II contradicts Vatican I on papal infallibility. It doesn't really talk about it. I am, however, saying that after the Council, there has been a significant stream in Catholic theology that seeks to reinterpret Vatican I using the principles of Vatican II in a way that just would have been unimaginable to the authors of Pastor Aeternus. They're doing this, at least in part, it seems to me, because papal infallibility understood objectively is so difficult to maintain. Thus, you've got this like rock in a hard place type of situation. So that might seem like a really overly long and technical tangent and an odd disagreement to stake out with the Catholic Church. But I think the ideas of papal infallibility have trickle-down effects that shape Catholic theology and life in ways that I deem rather unfortunate. The centralization of papal power has allowed for some of the worst abuses in my mind, and I think this is all downstream from a view of the papacy that is essentially too high for its own good. Furthermore, it's the very notion of infallibility that makes reform so difficult, which is where something like sola scriptura comes in as a potential corrective. Sola scriptura has a lot of downsides, but I'm willing to live with all of those for the sake of having an ongoing principle of reform. Now, I will say, giving credit to where it's due, Vatican II has been a wonderful step forward in the way of reform. But the things that make me admire it also threaten to undermine the whole system. I don't think it's in full continuity with the past. Much as I love Ratzinger, I find his hermeneutic of continuity difficult to justify. Thus, a Protestant like me finds themselves at a crossroads. The very thing I find myself protesting, papal infallibility, is so central to Catholic theology that to be successful in reforming this teaching, well, it just seems to pull the rug out from under the entire system. If I were merely interested in winning arguments, that'd be fine. Pull the rug out. We win. But I desire unity, and church unity will not happen without Rome. There is no unity when over 1 billion Christians can't be part of it. Maximal options that require Catholics not to be Catholic won't work, nor will the inverse. As it is, the protest against papal infallibility goes on. but I genuinely pray that minds smarter than mine can find a way forward. All that to say, the takeaway for you here in this video is that if you're going to be Protestant, you should know why you're Protestant. Of course, for many people, religion is not such an academic affair, and I think that's quite natural and perhaps even good. I wouldn't make this video a sermon. It would be a terribly, terrible sermon. This is directed to people like you, who spend their free times debating these matters online. Not everyone needs to reflect on these things, but if you're going to engage with church history and the claims of various churches, you should do so from an informed place. So, if you're a Protestant watching this, I'd love to know, what are your reasons for being Protestant?